The woman fled with her children to an abandoned cabin and found something hidden for a century. Sarah Johnson gripped the steering wheel of the old Chevrolet pickup tightly while her 8 children slept huddled together in the back seat. Her hands trembled not just from the cold of the Pennsylvania countryside dawn, but from fear of what she had left behind and uncertainty about what lay ahead. She was running away from Robert, the husband who during 15 years of marriage had turned her life into a daily nightmare of humiliation and threats. That night, when he yelled for the last time that he would take the children from her if she tried to leave, Sarah knew she couldn't wait another day. The cabin of her great-grandmother Elizabeth, abandoned for 100 years in the Appalachian Mountains, was the only place in the world he didn't know. The truck's engine started making a strange noise when she turned onto the dirt road leading to the property. Michael, her eldest son at 12 years old, woke up and looked out the window. "Mom, where are we?" he asked, his voice still sleepy. "We're here, my son. We've arrived at our new home." Sarah had never visited that place, but she knew every detail from the stories her grandmother Conception used to tell. Great-grandmother Elizabeth had built the cabin with her own hands in 1925, after fleeing from an arranged marriage in Pittsburgh. She was a woman ahead of her time, who raised 7 children alone on that isolated land. When the truck's headlights illuminated the small wood and stone structure, Sarah felt a tightness in her chest. The house was overgrown with weeds, its windows boarded up from the outside. It looked more like a haunted house than a refuge. "Mom, are we going to live here?" asked 10-year-old Emily, her eyes wide. "Just for now, sweetie, until things get better." 9-year-old Ethan got out of the truck carrying his twin sister, Ava, who was still asleep. The younger twins, 4-year-old John and Joseph, started crying when they saw the dark, scary place. 7-year-old Mary Elizabeth held 5-year-old Anthony's hand tightly as Sarah lifted the babies from her lap. Little Hope, just 8 months old, was in her mother's arms, while the youngest, 6-month-old Francis, was being carried by Michael. 8 children, 8 mouths to feed, 8 lives that depended entirely on her. Sarah found the key where her grandmother had said it would be, inside a hole in the 3rd foundation stone. Her hands shook as she opened the door, which creaked as if protesting the intrusion after so long. The smell of mold and dampness filled the air when she turned on the flashlight. Spiderwebs covered every corner, and a thick layer of dust coated the old furniture that remained exactly where Elizabeth had left it. "Mum, are there ghosts here?" whispered Anthony, hiding behind his mother's skirt. "No, my love. Just memories of a very brave woman." That first night, they all slept together in the living room using the blankets Sarah had brought. She stayed awake until dawn, listening to the sounds of the woods and wondering if she had made the right decision. When the sun rose and lit up the inside of the cabin through the cracks in the window boards, she saw for the first time the true dimensions of the place. The house was larger than it seemed from outside. Besides the main room, there were 2 bedrooms, a kitchen with a wood-burning stove, and a small pantry. At the back, a wooden staircase led to an attic that appeared untouched for decades. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out, now continuing. Michael was the first to climb the stairs. He was a responsible boy for his age, who had learned early to care for his younger siblings when his father was angry. In the attic, he found old trunks, clothes yellowed with age, and a stack of books that appeared to have been handwritten. "Mum, come up here. There's a lot of strange stuff." Sarah left the babies with Emily and went up to see what Michael had discovered. The attic was a true museum of Elizabeth's life. There were period clothing, handmade leather shoes, antique kitchen utensils, and most impressively, dozens of notebooks written in careful handwriting. "Look at this, Mom." Michael pointed to a wall at the back of the attic. "It seems like there's something hidden here." The wood on that part of the wall was a different color, as if it had been added later. Sarah ran her hand over the surface and felt a small gap. Carefully, she managed to loosen some planks, revealing a hidden space behind the wall. Inside the hiding place, 3 wooden boxes had been waiting for 100 years to be opened. Sarah's heart beat faster as she pulled out the first box. It was heavy and secured with an old latch that opened easily. The first thing she saw were letters. Dozens of letters yellowed with time, tied with blue satin ribbons. The handwriting was delicate and feminine, clearly written by Elizabeth, but the letters were addressed to herself, as if they were a personal diary. Sarah carefully opened one of the letters and began to read quietly. March 15th, 1925. Today I ran away from home. Daddy wanted me to marry the son of Colonel Alfred, a man who disgusted me just to look at. I took Mom's jewelry and came to the land Grandpa left. I'm going to build a new life here. I'm going to prove that a woman can live alone and be happy. What is this, Mom? Asked Michael, curious. They're the memories of your great-grandmother, son, the woman who built this house. Sarah continued reading other letters, discovering that Elizabeth had faced many hardships in the early years. She grew her own food, sewed her own clothes, and sold eggs and chickens in the nearest town to survive. But she was happy, genuinely happy, away from the oppression of her wealthy family in Pittsburgh. The second box contained documents, land deeds, birth certificates of Elizabeth's children, sales receipts, and, surprisingly, documents proving she had registered a brand of homemade products she sold in the region. But it was in the third box that Sarah found something that would completely change their lives. Wrapped in a linen cloth was a set of antique jewelry, gold necklaces, earrings with precious stones, rings that seemed worth a fortune, and a delicate tiara that still shone even after 100 years in storage. "My God," whispered Sarah, holding the most elaborate necklace. Along with the jewelry, there was a document that explained everything. It was a letter from Elizabeth to her descendants. "To whoever finds this treasure, this jewelry belonged to my mother and my grandmother. It's a family inheritance I brought with me when I ran away. If you're reading this, it's because you also needed courage to start over. Use them to build the life you deserve. The land here is rich, has a spring of pure water, and is worth much more than you imagine. The documents in the second box prove that all this belongs to the Johnsons. Be strong as I was. Elizabeth Johnson." Sarah began to cry, not from sadness, but from relief. For the first time since she had left home in the early hours of that morning, she felt that she might be able to give her children a decent life. Michael hugged her, still not fully understanding what was happening. "Are we going to be okay, Mom?" "We are, my son. We're going to be okay." In the following days, Sarah began to organize the house with the children's help. They cleaned every room, opened the windows to let fresh air in, and discovered that the property was much larger than they had imagined. There was an artesian well that still worked, an abandoned garden that could be restored, and even a small orchard with wild fruit trees. Emily proved to be very skilled at taking care of her younger siblings, while Ethan showed a knack for fixing things. Mary Elizabeth loved to cook and quickly learned how to use the wood-burning stove, and Anthony enjoyed feeding the chickens that still roamed freely around the property. But the peace didn't last long. On the 5th morning after their escape, Sarah heard the sound of a car approaching on the dirt road. Her blood ran cold when she recognized the engine sound. It was Robert's pickup truck. She ran inside and gathered all the children in the back room. "Stay quiet. Don't make a sound," she whispered, her heart racing. Robert pounded hard on the door. "Sarah, I know you're in there." "We're in." "Open this door right now." He started kicking the door, trying to break it down. Sarah hugged the babies tighter, feeling desperation take over. How had he managed to find them? "You can't hide from me forever. These children are mine too." Robert's voice was filled with anger, the same anger Sarah knew so well. After a few minutes of banging on the door and shouting, he stopped. Sarah heard footsteps around the house, as if he was looking for another entrance. Suddenly, a woman's voice joined the commotion outside. "You're trespassing on private property. This land has an owner." It was a firm voice, that of an older woman. Sarah risked peeking through the window crack and saw a white-haired lady confronting Robert. "And who are you?" he asked, irritated. "I'm Mrs. Margaret, the closest neighbor around here, and I've known this property since I was a girl. If people are living here, they have every right to. My wife ran off with my children. She can't keep them away from me." "Your wife?" Mrs. Margaret gave a dry laugh. "If she ran away, sir, she had her reasons. And from what I'm seeing here, you're not welcome. Sarah saw Robert clench his fists, but something about Mrs. Margaret's posture made him back down. The elderly woman was carrying a hunting rifle and seemed to know very well how to use it. "This isn't over," Robert growled, heading back to his pickup truck. "I'll be back with reinforcements." After he left, Mrs. Margaret knocked gently on the door. "You can open up, dear. He's gone." Sarah opened the door with trembling hands. Mrs. Margaret was a small woman, but with eyes that showed great wisdom and determination. "Thank you, ma'am. You have no idea of the danger you were in." "Danger?" Mrs. Margaret smiled. "Dear, I'm 72 years old. I've faced much worse than a spoiled man like that. Besides, I knew your great-grandmother. Elizabeth Johnson was a woman of courage, and from what I can see, that courage has passed on to you." "You knew my great-grandmother?" "I did, and I admired her greatly. When I was a girl, my mother used to bring me here to buy eggs and vegetables. Elizabeth was respected throughout the region, a woman ahead of her time." Mrs. Margaret entered the house and was impressed to see how Sarah had managed to organize everything in just a few days. "Do you plan to stay?" I don't know. I don't have money to support all these children, and my husband said he'd be back." "Your ex-husband," corrected Mrs. Margaret. "And about money, well, you might be surprised by what this land is worth nowadays." That afternoon, Mrs. Margaret told Sarah stories about Elizabeth that her own family had never shared. Her great-grandmother wasn't just a courageous woman, she was a businesswoman. She had created a brand of homemade products that was famous throughout the region. Jams, preserves, natural remedies made with herbs from the woods. "Your great-grandmother was rich, dear, truly rich. And from what I recall, she never sold that land. It must be worth a fortune today." Sarah told Mrs. Margaret about finding the boxes in the attic, showing her the documents. Who could read very well despite her advanced age? "Oh my God!" the lady exclaimed when she saw the deeds. "My dear, you're rich. This land stretches all the way to the river, including the mineral water spring that supplies 3 towns in the region. And look here." She pointed to one of the documents. "Your great-grandmother registered the water rights too." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. But Sarah knew that having a right to something on paper and actually being able to claim those rights were 2 very different things. She was a simple woman who had only studied up to elementary school. Robert always handled all the family's bureaucratic matters. "Mrs. Margaret, even if these documents are real, I wouldn't know where to begin to sort this out. I know someone who can help. Mr. Richard, a lawyer in Lawrence who has handled similar cases before. He's an honest man, unlike most." In the following days, while waiting to hear from the lawyer, Sarah explored the property further with the children. They discovered there was a small stone building near the spring that appeared to have been used as a mill. Inside it, more surprises. Bags of old grains, farming tools in good condition, and even some seeds stored in clay pots. Michael found a diary buried near the mill. It was different from the letters in the attic. This diary contained technical notes about planting, recipes for preserves and medicines, and sales records that showed Elizabeth had a very prosperous business. 1930, sold 200 jars of Jabuticaba jam to the town hotel. Profit, 50,000 rays. With this money, I can buy more chickens and plant a larger garden. 1932, the cough medicine I make with guaco and honey is being sought even in Pittsburgh. I need to plant more guaco. 1935, registered the Elizabeth's Naturals trademark at the notary. Now my products have legal protection. Sarah realized her great-grandmother hadn't just survived on that land. She had thrived, built a solid business and left a legacy that had been forgotten over time. But trouble wasn't long in coming. A week after Robert's visit, a man in a suit showed up at the property. He introduced himself as George Parker, Robert's lawyer. "Mrs. Johnson, I'm here to notify you that your husband is filing for custody of the children, claiming abandonment of the home and inability to support the children." Sarah felt her legs go weak. "Can he do that?" "He can and he is. The hearing is scheduled for next Monday. If you don't appear, custody will automatically be granted to him. George Parker looked around the property with contempt. Ma'am, be reasonable. This place isn't suitable for children. Your husband can provide a decent life for them. Ex-husband, Sarah corrected, finding strength she didn't know she had. And about a decent life, you have no idea what you're talking about. After the lawyer left, Sarah felt desperate. How could she attend a hearing without being able to afford a lawyer? How would she prove she could support 8 children alone? It was Emily who brought her back to reality. Mum, you're not alone. We're here with you, and you're the best mother in the world. That evening, Mrs. Margaret returned accompanied by a man about 50 years old, tall with greying hair. Sarah, this is Mr. Richard I told you about. I explained the whole situation to him. Richard Thompson examined the documents carefully for over an hour. Her expression gradually shifted from curiosity to surprise, and finally to excitement. Mrs. Johnson, you hold one of the largest inheritances I've seen in 30 years of law practice. But Mr. Thompson, I don't have money to pay your fees. Who mentioned payment? Richard smiled. This case is so interesting that I'd work for free just for the satisfaction of solving it, but it won't be necessary. When we access the assets that are rightfully yours, there will be sufficient resources. Richard explained that the first step would be to prove the line of descent from Sarah to Elizabeth, which would be easy with the documents she had. The second step would be to survey all the assets described in the deeds. And what about the custody hearing? Asked Sarah anxiously. Ah, about that. Richard smiled again. I'm sure when the judge learns that you own lands valued at millions and have the means to support your children properly, the perspective will change quite a bit. But Richard warned that the process wouldn't be simple or quick. Robert would certainly try to contest everything, claiming that Sarah lacked the mental capacity to manage an inheritance of that size. He'll try to use the fact that you ran away as proof of emotional instability. I didn't run away, said Sarah firmly. I freed myself. In the days leading up to the hearing, Sarah experienced moments of extreme anguish. At night, when the children were asleep, she walked around the property, trying to find the strength to face Robert again. It was during one of these nighttime walks that she discovered something that would change everything. Near the spring, there was a small stone structure she hadn't fully explored yet. Inside, she found something extraordinary. Hundreds of still-sealed jars of preserves made by Elizabeth decades ago. The preserves were perfectly preserved by the cool, dry environment of the structure. Jabuticaba jelly, dulce de leche, pequi preserve, fig compote. Each jar had a handwritten label with the date and contents, but the most impressive were the notebooks accompanying the preserves. Elizabeth had meticulously documented her recipes, suppliers, customers, and profits. It was a true manual on how to build a prosperous business in the countryside. Sarah spent the night reading those notebooks and feeling a deep connection with her great-grandmother. Elizabeth had faced the same fears, the same doubts, but had never given up. 1928. Today I cried a lot. The children are sick, and I have no money for the doctor. But I can't give up. They depend on me. I'll sell the chickens if I have to. 1929. I did it. The doctor said the children are cured. The medicine I made with herbs from the woods worked better than the expensive ones from the pharmacy. Maybe I found my calling. 1930. I opened my first bank account in the city. The manager said he'd never seen a woman alone do business like this. He'd better get used to it because I'm just getting started. On the morning of the hearing, Sarah dressed in her best clothes and left the children with Mrs. Margaret. Michael wanted to come along, but she preferred to spare him that experience. The Lawrence courthouse was crowded. Robert had arrived early, accompanied by his lawyer, and some people Sarah didn't recognize. He was dressed as always, impeccably, and smiled ironically when he saw her enter. "Your Honor, as you can see, my wife is clearly unstable," said George Parker when the hearing began. "She abandoned a comfortable home to live in a cabin in the middle of the woods with 8 small children." "Ex-wife," corrected Richard Thompson. "And far from being unstable, my client made a courageous decision to protect her children from a toxic family environment." The judge. Anthony Miller was a man of about 60, known for his impartiality. He listened carefully to both sides' arguments. "Mrs. Johnson, he addressed Sarah. "Can you explain why you made the decision to leave home with the children in the middle of the night?" Sarah took a deep breath. This was the most important moment of her life. "Your Honor, for 15 years I tried to be a good wife. I endured humiliation, shouting, threats, but when he said he would take my children away from me if I tried to leave, I knew I had to protect them." "These are her fabrications," shouted Robert. "I never laid a finger on her." "You don't need to lay a finger to destroy a person," Sarah replied, looking directly at him. "Words hurt as much as punches." Richard then presented the inheritance documents. The judge was visibly surprised to see the extent of the property and the estimated value of the assets. "Mrs. Johnson, were you aware of this inheritance before leaving home?" "No, Your Honor. I discovered it by chance when I was cleaning my great-grandmother's house." "And yet Mr. Robert claims she is incapable of managing these assets?" the judge asked Robert's lawyer. George Parker was visibly uncomfortable. It was difficult to argue that a woman was incapable of caring for her children when she had just discovered she possessed a fortune. But Robert didn't give up easily. He stood up and made a dramatic speech about how he loved his children and wanted to give them the best education possible. "Your Honor, I can afford to put these children in the best schools, give them opportunities she could never offer." It was then that Richard played his final card. "Your Honor, I would like to call a witness." "Mrs." Margaret entered the courtroom with steady steps, carrying a folder of documents. "This is Mrs. Margaret Costa, a neighbor of the property for over 70 years. She personally knew Elizabeth Johnson and can testify to the legitimacy of the inheritance." Mrs. Margaret testified for over an hour, telling stories about Elizabeth and confirming that the lands had always belonged to the Johnson family. But she saved her most shocking revelation for last. "Your Honor, I also need to say that I have known Mr. Robert for many years. My nephew worked for him for 5 years and told me many things about how he treated his family." Robert's lawyer tried to object, but the judge allowed her to continue. "That man is known in the area for his violent temper. There have been several complaints at the police station, although Sarah never filed a formal complaint out of fear." Robert turned red with anger, but couldn't deny Mrs. Margaret's words without risking making his situation worse. The judge called a recess to review all the documents. During that time, Sarah felt her heart would leap out of her chest from beating so hard. When the hearing resumed, Judge Anthony Miller was serious. "After reviewing all the evidence presented, it is clear that Mrs. Johnson did not abandon the home irresponsibly, but out of necessity to protect herself and her children. Furthermore, the discovery of the inheritance demonstrates that she does have the means to adequately support the children." Sarah began to cry with relief. "Therefore, I grant permanent custody of the 8 minors to the mother, Mrs. Sarah Johnson. Mr. Robert will have the right to supervised visits, provided he demonstrates that he has undergone psychological counseling to control his temper." Robert left the courtroom furious, promising to appeal the decision. But Sarah knew she had won the most important battle of her life. In the following months, with the help of Richard Thompson, Sarah formalized possession of all the lands inherited from Elizabeth. The total value of the property was even greater than they had imagined. Besides the land and the spring, high-quality clay deposits and a small quartz mine were discovered. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. But Sarah didn't want to simply sell everything and move to the city. She had fallen in love with that simple life close to nature. The children were happier than ever, playing freely around the property, helping in the garden, and learning about country life. She decided to follow in Elizabeth's footsteps and restart the natural products business. With the recipes found in the old notebooks, and with the help of Mrs. Margaret, who knew all the secrets of the region's medicinal herbs, Sarah began producing jams, preserves, and home remedies. Michael showed great interest in the business and started helping his mother with calculations and organizing sales. Emily discovered she had a talent for crafts and began making baskets and decorative items to sell alongside the food products. Ethan proved to be an excellent gardener and took responsibility for caring for the vegetable garden and orchard. Mary Elizabeth specialized in the kitchen, perfecting Elizabeth's recipes and creating some of her own. Even the younger children had their roles. Anthony lovingly took care of the chickens. The twins, John and Joseph, helped harvest fruits and vegetables, and Ava, though still small, already showed interest in helping her sister Emily with the crafts. In no time, Elizabeth's Naturals products became known throughout the region again. Hotels, restaurants, and natural product stores placed regular orders. Sarah couldn't keep up with the demand alone. That's when she had an idea that would change not only her family's life, but also that of many other families in the area. She began hiring women from the nearby village to help with production. Many of them were like she had been, single mothers, widows, or women who needed extra income to support their children. Mrs. Conception, a 60-year-old woman who had recently lost her husband, was one of the first hired. She knew all the secrets of traditional Pennsylvania sweets and taught Sarah recipes that weren't in Elizabeth's notebooks. Mary Josephine, a 40-year-old woman who had separated from an alcoholic husband, specialized in natural remedies. She had impressive knowledge about medicinal plants, inherited from her grandmother who was a healer. Rosemary, 32 years old and mother of 4, became responsible for vegetable preserves. She had learned the techniques from her mother, who always had a large garden to support her large family. Within a year, what had started as a desperate escape turned into a thriving business, employing 15 women from the region. Sarah built a small factory on the property, always careful to maintain the artisanal quality of the products. But success brought new challenges. Robert, who had permanently lost custody of the children after being caught fighting with other men in a bar, began spreading rumors that Sarah was exploiting her employees and evading taxes. He also tried to convince some suppliers not to sell ingredients to her, using his influence in the area. Robert had always been a man with many contacts in local commerce, and some older merchants still respected him. The pressure reached the point where Sarah had difficulty buying sugar, an essential ingredient for her jams and sweets. She had to drive to more distant cities to find suppliers who didn't know Robert. It was during one of these trips that she met Samuel Oliver, owner of an agricultural products distributorship in Hot Springs. Samuel was a 55-year-old man, widowed for 3 years, who was impressed with the quality of Sarah's products. "Ma'am, I've worked with natural products for 30 years and rarely see this kind of artisanal quality," he said, tasting a jabuticaba jam. "Thank you, Mr. Samuel. These are old recipes from my great-grandmother. I'd like to propose a partnership. I can distribute your products throughout southern Pennsylvania. I have contacts in New York City, too." Sarah was excited by the proposal, but also hesitant. She didn't want to lose control of the business or compromise product quality by increasing production too much. "I understand your concern," said Samuel. "How about we start slow? You maintain your current production, and I'll help with distribution. As demand grows, we'll see how to expand without losing quality." The partnership with Samuel completely transformed the business's reach. Within 6 months, Elizabeth's Naturals products were being sold in dozens of cities. Sarah had to hire more women and build a second production line. Michael, now 13, proved to be an excellent administrator. He created an inventory control system and helped his mother organize the business finances. Emily, 11, began taking correspondence courses in crafts to improve her techniques. But it was Ethan who had the most innovative idea. He suggested they create a rural tour on the property where people could see the production process, learn about medicinal plants, and buy products directly from the factory. "Mom, city people love seeing how things are made. We can show the story of great-grandmother Elizabeth, teach about country life, and sell more products too." Ethan's idea was a tremendous success. On weekends, dozens of families visited the property. Mrs. Margaret became the official tour guide, telling stories about Elizabeth and explaining medicinal plants. The children also participated, showing how they cared for the animals and vegetable garden. Visitors were charmed by the family's simplicity and joy, and many returned regularly to buy products and watch the children grow. The business's success caught the attention of the local press. A story in the Lawrence newspaper recounted Sarah's transformation from subjugated housewife to successful rural entrepreneur. The article gained traction, and soon interview requests from radio and television arrived. Sarah initially resisted the exposure, fearing Robert might use it against her somehow. But Richard Thompson convinced her that visibility would be positive for the business and could also inspire other women in similar situations. The first interview was on local radio. Sarah was nervous but spoke sincerely about her journey. "I'm not a heroine," she said. "I'm just a mother who did what she had to do to protect her children. My great-grandmother's inheritance was a blessing, but what truly changed our lives was the courage to start over." The interview moved many listeners. In the following weeks, Sarah received dozens of letters from women experiencing similar situations, asking for advice and inspiration. That's when she had a new idea. With the business now established and profitable, she decided to use part of the profits to create a social project. She wanted to transform part of the property into a place where women in vulnerable situations could restart their lives. "Michael, remember when I told you your great-grandmother was a woman ahead of her time?" she asked her son. "I remember, Mom. I think she would be proud if she knew we're helping other women like she helped our family, even after all this time." Sarah began planning the creation of a professional training center on the property. Women could learn food production techniques, crafts, gardening, and basic business administration. While in the program, they would have housing, meals, and childcare. The idea gained support from several local institutions. The Lawrence City government offered help with bureaucratic matters. A local university volunteered to send interns to teach classes, and even some regional businesses offered to donate equipment. Samuel Oliver was one of the main supporters of the project. He not only made a significant donation, but also offered to teach distribution and sales to future entrepreneurs. "Sarah, you're creating something much bigger than a business," he said during a planning meeting. "You're creating a legacy." The construction of the center began in the second year after the inheritance was discovered. Michael and Ethan helped with the planning. Using math and drawing knowledge they had learned from private tutors, Sarah had hired to supplement the children's education. Emily created a special line of handmade products that would be sold exclusively to fund the center. Mary Elizabeth developed a menu of Pennsylvania-style dishes that would be served in the rural restaurant that would be part of the complex. During construction, new problems arose. Robert, who had moved to a nearby town after losing several clients who sympathized with Sarah, started frequenting local bars, spreading lies about the project. He claimed Sarah was misusing public funds, that the center was a front for illegal activities, and that she was exploiting vulnerable women. The rumors were absurd, but some people ended up believing them. The situation reached a point where a group of men showed up at the property to verify if everything was being done correctly. They were led by Tony Smith, a local farmer who always had difficulty accepting women in leadership positions. "Mrs. Sarah, we've received complaints that you're doing irregular things here," said Tony, looking around with disdain. "What kind of irregularities?" asked Sarah, keeping calm. "They say you're bringing women from other places without notifying the authorities. This could be dangerous for the community." Sarah took a deep breath. She knew that behind those accusations was Robert's influence. "Mr. Tony, all the project documents are in order, approved by the city government and supervised by lawyers. If you want to verify, feel free." Richard Thompson was present and immediately presented all the legal documentation for the project. There was nothing irregular, and Tony left the property with his tail between his legs. But the attacks didn't stop there. Robert managed to convince a councilman from a neighboring town to make a motion questioning the morality of the project. The councilman argued that gathering divorced and problematic women in one place could cause family breakdown in the region. The motion created enormous controversy. Local newspapers published articles defending and attacking the project. Sarah found herself at the center of a discussion that went far beyond her personal story. Then something unexpected happened. The women in the region began organizing in support of the project. Mrs. Margaret led a movement that gathered more than 200 women in a peaceful demonstration in front of the city council. "We're here to support one of our own," Mrs. Margaret said into the microphone. "Sarah Johnson represents the courage we all wish we had." She transformed her pain into strength, her need into opportunity, and now she wants to share that opportunity with other women in need. The demonstration was covered by the regional press and soon gained statewide attention. Journalists from Pittsburgh came to learn about Sarah's story and were impressed by what they found. A reporter from ABC Network did a special feature on the project for the Sunday program. The report showed Sarah working with the children, explained the history of Elizabeth's inheritance, and interviewed several women who were already benefiting from the program. "What would you say to women going through the same situation you experienced?" asked the reporter. "I would say courage isn't the absence of fear," Sarah replied. "It's doing what needs to be done, even when afraid, and that we all have an Elizabeth within us, waiting for the opportunity to show what we're capable of." The report had enormous national impact. Sarah received hundreds of letters from across the United States, many from women sharing their own stories of overcoming adversity. Some came with donations for the project. The training center opened 6 months later, attended by state authorities and representatives from non-governmental organizations. The first class had 20 women from various towns in the region. Among them was Carol, 28 years old, who had fled an abusive husband with 2 small children. There was Josephine, 52, who had been widowed and didn't know how to support her family, and also Grace, 35, who had never held a steady job because she lacked professional qualifications. Each brought stories of hardship, but also a tremendous will to start over. Sarah saw something of herself in each of them, that early morning when she fled with her 8 children to the abandoned cabin. The center's program lasted 6 months. During this time, the women learned food production techniques, basic administration, crafts, and also participated in group therapy sessions to build self-esteem and process trauma. Their children attended a rural school Sarah had created on the property, with qualified teachers and a teaching method that valued both traditional knowledge and conventional subjects. At the end of the program, each woman received a starter kit to set up her own business and continued receiving support for another year. Many built thriving businesses, some partnered to form cooperatives, others were hired by local companies. Carol specialized in sugar-free sweets and carved out a market niche in spas and beauty clinics. Josephine discovered a talent for floral arrangements and opened a flower shop that became a local reference. Grace became one of Sarah's best employees and later took over coordination of one production line. The program's success caught the attention of international organizations. An American foundation interested in women's empowerment projects offered funding to expand the center. A European university proposed an exchange program with similar projects, but Sarah always took care to maintain the project's essence. She didn't want it to grow so large it would lose the family-like, welcoming character that made it special. "Mum, you could create centers like this across the entire United States," said Michael, now 15, who showed great interest in the social aspects of the project. "I could, son, but it's not about quantity, it's about quality. I'd rather help 20 women well than help 200 poorly." 3 years after the center's opening, Sarah received an unexpected invitation. The state government wanted to create a statewide program based on the model she had developed. She would be invited to coordinate the implementation in various regions of Pennsylvania. It was a unique opportunity to expand the impact of the work, but it would also mean much more responsibility and less time with her family and the original business. Sarah spent weeks reflecting on the proposal. She talked with the children, who were already teenagers, and had well-formed opinions on the matter. "Mum, Elizabeth built something here that lasted 100 years, said Emily, now 14. "If you expand this work, it could last much longer and help many more people. But I'm afraid of losing control, of the project becoming too bureaucratic and losing its soul." "Then you set the rules from the start," suggested Ethan, 12. "Make a manual on how it should work, train the responsible people, and visit regularly to check if it's being followed." Mary Elizabeth, 10, always practical, went straight to the point. "Mum, how many women have you helped here?" "About 80, counting all the groups." "And how many could be helped if there were centers in all the regions?" "Thousands, I imagine." "Then you already know the answer." Sarah decided to accept the proposal, but with conditions. She would keep the original center running exactly as it was, under her direct supervision. The new centers would be coordinated by women who had gone through the program and demonstrated leadership ability. The training of future coordinators would be done at the original property, so they would fully understand the philosophy of the work. and Sarah would visit each center at least 4 times a year to monitor the development. The expansion began with 3 pilot centers in different regions of the state. Carol was chosen to coordinate one of them, Josephine another, and Grace the third. Each brought with them the experience of having benefited from the program and the determination to pass that opportunity on to other women. The results were even better than expected. In 2 years, the 3 pilot centers had already trained over 200 women, who in turn created more than 100 small businesses in the region. The program gained national and international recognition. Sarah was invited to give lectures at universities, participate in conferences on women's entrepreneurship, and even speak at the UN about sustainable rural development. But she never forgot her origins. Every morning before starting any administrative activities, she walked through the original property, visited the cabin where it all began, and remembered how she had arrived there with 8 children and a suitcase of clothes. The cabin had been restored and turned into a small museum of Elizabeth's and Sarah's history. Visitors from all over the country came to see the place where a movement that had already transformed the lives of thousands of women was born. Michael was studying business administration at a university in New York City, but he returned every weekend to help with the project. He had decided that he wanted to dedicate his career to the development of social projects. Emily had become a recognized artist, selling her pieces in New York City and Miami. But she always reserved a portion of her production for the center, and the money raised went entirely to the scholarship program. Ethan had discovered a vocation for sustainable agriculture and was revolutionizing the property's planting techniques. Under his guidance, the farm had become a model of organic production that was studied by agronomists from across the country. Mary Elizabeth had specialized in regional cuisine and created a restaurant on the property that served typical Pennsylvania dishes made with ingredients produced right there. The restaurant had become a must-stop spot for tourists in the region. The younger ones had also found their paths. Anthony, now 8 years old, showed an interest in veterinary medicine and took care of all the animals on the property. The twins, John and Joseph, 7 years old, were inseparable and displayed a talent for music, livening up community gatherings with their performances. Ava, 6 years old, was the most studious of all and could already read and write perfectly. She loved listening to stories about Elizabeth and always said that when she grew up, she wanted to help women too. The babies, Francis and Hope, now 4 and 5 years old respectively, were the darlings of the entire community. They had grown up in that environment of collective work and solidarity and naturally developed a very strong sense of social responsibility. 5 years after the escape to the cabin, Sarah received news that made her thoughtful. Robert had tried to contact her through Richard Thompson. He was facing financial and health difficulties and wanted an opportunity to reconcile with his children. Sarah's first reaction was complete refusal. The wounds were still too fresh, and she didn't trust his intentions. But Michael, now 17 years old, surprised her with his maturity. "Mum, I think we should talk to him." "Why, son?" "After everything he did. Because forgiveness isn't for him, it's for us. As long as we hold on to anger, he still has power over our lives." Emily agreed with her brother. "Mum, we're strong enough now to face him. And maybe he has changed. People can change." After much reflection and talking with all the children, Sarah decided to accept a meeting. But it would be on her terms, at the property, with all the children and Richard Thompson present. Robert arrived on the scheduled date driving an old car and wearing simple clothes. He had aged a lot in 5 years, was thinner, and had a defeated air about him that Sarah had never seen before. "Sarah, I wanted to apologize," were his first words. She listened to him in silence as he spoke about how he had reflected on his mistakes, how he regretted being a controlling husband and an absent father. He shared that he had lost his business, his home, and was living in a rented room. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he said, looking at his children. "I just wanted you to know that I'm sorry and that I'm proud of what you've managed to build here." The children listened to him politely, but kept their distance. 5 years was enough time for them to understand that life without their father's aggressive presence had been much better. Michael was the first to speak. "Dad, I appreciate the apology, But I think you need to understand that we've built a new life, a good life, and we don't want to go back to how things were before. I know, son. I didn't come here to try to take you back. I came to say that you made the right choice." Emily added, "If you've really changed, we can have a relationship. But it will be a new relationship based on respect. And if you go back to how you were before, we won't give you a second chance." Robert agreed to all the conditions. He began visiting the children once a month, always under supervision. Gradually, he built a different relationship with them, based on humility and acknowledgement of his past mistakes. Sarah never fully trusted him again, but she recognized that forgiveness had been good for her and the children. They had completely freed themselves from the past. 8 years after the escape to the cabin, Sarah's program had expanded to 15 states in the United States. Over 5,000 women had been directly benefited, and it's estimated that more than 20,000 people had been indirectly impacted through the businesses created and the families helped. Sarah, now 43 years old, had become a national reference in rural female entrepreneurship. She wrote a book telling her story, which became a bestseller and whose copyright was entirely donated to the program. Samuel Oliver, who had become much more than a business partner over the years, proposed to Sarah. They had developed a deep friendship based on shared values and mutual admiration for the work each one did. The wedding was simple, held on the property, with the presence of all the women who had gone through the program and the families from the neighboring communities. Michael led his mother to the altar. Emily was the maid of honor, and all the children participated in the ceremony. Mrs. Margaret, already 80 years old but still very active, was the wedding sponsor. In her speech, she made sure to remember how everything had begun. 8 years ago, I saw a courageous woman arriving here in the middle of the night with 8 children and a dream of freedom. Today, I see a leader who transformed her pain into hope for thousands of other women. Elizabeth would be proud. Samuel brought to the family a peace that Sarah hadn't known for a long time. He loved all the children as if they were his own, and integrated perfectly into the family dynamics and the social work. Together, they created a social investment fund that financed similar projects in countries in Latin America and Africa. The United States experience was being adapted to different cultural realities, but always maintaining the fundamental principles of female empowerment and community development. Michael graduated in business administration and took over the national coordination of the program. Emily opened an art school on the property, where she taught craft techniques to the women in the program and to local youth. Ethan became a specialist in sustainable agriculture and was invited to consult for international organizations. Mary Elizabeth opened a culinary school that became a reference in regional cuisine. The younger ones also found their callings. Anthony was studying veterinary medicine and already took care of the health of all the animals in the region. The twins, John and Joseph, formed a musical duo that entertained events throughout the state. Ava, now 11 years old, was already showing interest in law and said she wanted to defend women like Mommy. Francis and Hope, now 9 and 10 years old, grew up in that environment of solidarity and naturally developed social awareness. They organized toy drives for underprivileged children and always participated in the center's activities. 10 years after that night of escape, Sarah was in her office reviewing reports from the centers when Michael rushed in. "Mom, you need to see this." He turned on the television to a national news channel. A reporter was interviewing a young woman whom Sarah recognized immediately. It was Beatrice, from the first class of the center. At 25 years old, Beatrice Smith is the owner of a company that earns $2 million a year, producing natural cosmetics, the reporter was saying. It all started when she participated in a training program for women in social vulnerability, created by Sarah Johnson in rural Pennsylvania. Beatrice was being interviewed because her company had been chosen as one of the 100 best small businesses in the country. She told her story of overcoming and made sure to credit her success to Sarah's program. "When I arrived there, I was a broken woman who thought I was good for nothing," said Beatrice. "Mrs. Sarah taught me that every woman has a strength inside her. She gave me the tools, but most importantly, she gave me the confidence to use those tools." Sarah began to cry while watching the interview. Michael hugged her. "Mother, Did you see how many Beatrices are out there now? I did, son. And I keep thinking about Elizabeth, how happy she would be, knowing that the small seed of courage she planted 100 years ago has turned into this entire forest. That night, Sarah walked to the original cabin, as she always did whenever she needed to reflect on something important. The cabin was now lit up and well maintained, but she still preferred to sit on the same step where she had sat that first morning, trying to understand how she would support 8 children alone. Samuel came to sit beside her. "What are you thinking about?" "I'm thinking that sometimes life pushes us to places we never imagined. I came to this cabin running away, thinking I was at the end of the line, and actually I was at the beginning of everything. Do you think you would change anything if you could go back in time?" Sarah thought for a moment. "I think I would change how things happened. I wish so much suffering hadn't been necessary, but the outcome I wouldn't change, because it wasn't just my life that changed, it was thousands of lives." Samuel held her hand. "Elizabeth planted a seed. You turned it into a tree, and now your daughters and granddaughters will make that tree into a forest." 15 years after her escape, Sarah's program had become an international model for social development. She received awards from the UN, the European Union, and several human rights organizations. But the recognition that moved her most came from an unexpected source. At a ceremony in the Pennsylvania State Assembly, she received the title of Honorary Citizen of the State for her contribution to the social and economic development of the region. What moved her wasn't the title itself, but rather seeing in the audience hundreds of women who had gone through the program. They came from all corners of the state to honor her, bringing their children, their husbands, their thriving businesses. Carol was there with her 3 children, all now in college. Josephine was accompanied by her grandchildren, whom she had raised after her daughter emigrated abroad. Grace came with the 15 employees of the cooperative she had created. And in the middle of the audience, in a wheelchair, was Mrs. Margaret, now 85 years old, but with eyes shining with pride. In her acceptance speech, Sarah made sure to tell the whole story, from the desperate escape to that moment of recognition. "I didn't receive this title alone," she said. "I received it in the name of Elizabeth Johnson, who 100 years ago planted the first seed of courage, in the name of Mrs. Margaret, who took me in when I needed it most, in the name of all the women who had the courage to start over, and especially in the name of my 8 children, who taught me that love can transform any situation." The audience stood up to applaud, and many people cried with emotion. After the ceremony, Sarah was approached by a young reporter who wanted to do a special story about her life. "Mrs. Sarah, what advice would you give to a woman who is going through today the same situation you went through 15 years ago?" Sarah thought for a moment before answering. "I would tell her that courage isn't a feeling. Courage is a decision that you deserve a better life and that your children deserve a better life, and that when you make that decision and act based on it, the universe conspires to help you." And about fear, how do you deal with fear? Fear will always exist. I still feel fear sometimes, but I've learned that fear is just a feeling. It's not a command. You feel the fear, acknowledge that it's there, thank it for trying to protect you, and then do what needs to be done anyway. Do you still remember that first night in the cabin? I remember it like it was yesterday. I looked at my 8 children sleeping and thought, my God, what have I done? But do you know what the first thought I had when I woke up the next day was? What? We made it. We got through the first night. If we made it through one, we can make it through 1,000. 20 years after the escape, Sarah woke up on a sunny morning and decided to take a special walk. She wanted to visit all the important places of her journey, from the original cabin to the training center, passing by the factory and the school. Samuel went with her, as did Michael and Emily, who were visiting the property with their own children. Michael had married a lawyer he met during social work, and they had 2 girls. Emily had married an artist, and they had a boy. Ethan, Mary Elizabeth, Anthony, the twins John and Joseph, Ava, Francis, and Hope also joined the walk. All adults now, all with their own careers and families, but all still very connected to the property and social work. The walk began at the original cabin, which was now visited by thousands of people each year. There were signs telling the story of Elizabeth and Sarah, but the place still maintained the simplicity and tranquility that had attracted Sarah on that first dawn. "You know what amazes me the most," said Emily, holding her son in her arms. "It's thinking that all this started with great-grandmother Elizabeth running away from an arranged marriage. One personal decision of hers changed the lives of thousands of people 100 years later. It's proof that our choices have consequences far beyond what we imagine," added Michael. They visited the artesian well that still provided pure water for the entire property, the vegetable garden where Ethan had developed sustainable farming techniques now used in several universities, the orchard where the children used to play when they were little. They passed by the factory, which now produced over 200 different products and directly employed 300 people from the region. They visited Emily's art school, where young people from all over the area learned traditional craft techniques. They went to Mary Elizabeth's restaurant, which had become a tourist attraction in its own right, famous for the authenticity of its dishes and the story of its creator. They visited Anthony's veterinary clinic, which cared not only for the animals on the property, but for the entire rural region. They watched a rehearsal by the twins John and Joseph, who now had a national music career but always returned to perform at community festivals. They talked with Ava, who had become a lawyer specializing in women's rights and coordinated the legal department of all the centers. Francis and Hope, now 24 and 25, had taken different but complementary paths. Francis had become a psychologist and coordinated therapeutic services at the centers. Hope had graduated in education and created a teaching methodology based on women's oral history. The walk ended at the training center, where a new class was starting the program. 20 women from different cities, all with stories of hardship, but all with the hope of starting over. Sarah talked to each of them, as she did with every class. She wanted to know their stories, understand their needs, convey the confidence that it was indeed possible to build a new life. One of the women, Christina, 32 years old, approached her at the end of the conversation. "Mrs. Sarah, I wanted to thank you for creating this place. When I learned about the program, for the first time in years, I felt hope." "Tell me your story, Christina." "I was married to a man who forbade me from working, studying, having friends. When I tried to leave, he threatened to take my daughter away. I was afraid for years to try again, until a social worker told me about your program." Sarah embraced Christina. "Do you know what strikes me about your story, Christina? It's that you didn't give up. Even with fear, even with the threats, you kept looking for a way out. That's courage. Do you think I'll be able to rebuild my life?" "I don't think, I'm sure. Because you've already taken the first step, which is always the hardest. And now you're not alone anymore." That night, during the family dinner, Samuel asked a question that surprised everyone. "Sarah, if you could leave a message for the future generations of women in your family, what would you say?" Sarah thought for a long moment before answering. "I would say that each of us has an Elizabeth inside, an ancestral strength that comes from the women who came before us and faced hardships we can't even imagine. When you need courage, remember the stories of these women. Remember that if they made it, you can too." "And for women who aren't in our family?" asked Hope. "For them, I would say we are all part of the same family. The family of women who refuse to accept a life too small for their dreams. The family of women who prefer to fight rather than submit. The family of women who turn their pain into strength to help other women." Emily was recording the conversation on her phone. "Mom, I'm going to save this to tell my grandchildren." "And they will tell their grandchildren," added Michael. "The family story will continue." 25 years after fleeing to the cabin, Sarah received news that deeply moved her. The program she had created was chosen by the UN as a global model for social development and would be implemented in 50 countries. The recognition ceremony would be in New York, and Sarah was invited to give a speech to representatives from all member countries of the United Nations. It was the first time she would travel outside the United States. Samuel, their children and grandchildren accompanied her on this historic trip. In her speech at the UN, Sarah made sure to tell her whole story. from the most difficult moments to that moment of international recognition. Ladies and gentlemen, 25 years ago, I was a woman with no resources, no higher education, no influential contacts. I was just a desperate mother trying to protect her children. Today I am here speaking to representatives from all over the world because I learned a simple truth. No matter how small the seed, if it is planted in the right soil and cared for with love, it can become a giant tree. She told about Elizabeth, about discovering the inheritance, about Mrs. Margaret, about all the women who had gone through the program. The program you want to implement in your countries wasn't created by social development experts. It was created by ordinary women who decided they deserved a better life. It was created by women who understood that true wealth lies in the ability to turn our experiences of pain into opportunities for healing for others. The speech received a standing ovation from all present. Several ambassadors approached afterward to talk with Sarah about how to adapt the program to the realities of their countries. But the most emotional moment of the trip happened on the last day, when Sarah received an unexpected call. It was Christina, the woman she had met at the center years before. "Mrs. Sarah, I wanted you to know that I just opened my second store, and I hired 5 employees, all single mothers who needed an opportunity." "Christina, how happy I am to hear that. Mrs. Sarah, you changed my life. But most importantly, you taught me that I could change other people's lives too. Now I understand why you do this work. It's not just about receiving help. It's about passing that help forward." After hanging up the phone, Sarah felt more fulfilled than at any other moment in her life. Not because of the ceremony at the UN, not because of the international recognition, but because she knew Christina had understood the true essence of the program, the transformative power of helping others. 30 years after fleeing to the cabin, Sarah, now 65 years old, decided to write her complete memoirs. Not just the story of creating the program, but a deep reflection on all the lessons she had learned throughout the journey. The book, titled The Cabin of Courage: How a 100-Year Inheritance Changed Thousands of Lives, became a worldwide phenomenon. It was translated into 40 languages and inspired the creation of similar programs on every continent. But what moved Sarah the most were the letters she received from readers around the world. Women from India telling how they had used the book's principles to escape arranged marriages. African women explaining how they had created cooperatives based on the model described in the book. European women reporting how they had found the courage to leave abusive relationships. One letter in particular deeply touched her. It was from a young Japanese woman named Yuki. "Dear Mrs. Sarah, I read your book when I was thinking of giving up on life. My husband beat me every day, and I thought there was no way out. But when I read about your escape to the cabin with 8 children, I thought, if she managed with 8 kids, I can manage with 1. I fled to my grandmother's house in the countryside and discovered she had a small tea plantation that was abandoned. I restarted production, and today I have an organic tea company that employs 15 women in situations similar to mine. Thank you for teaching me that courage is contagious." Letters like this arrived every week. Sarah realized that the story of Elizabeth and hers had become a universal symbol that it's possible to start over, no matter the age, circumstances, or available resources. One autumn morning, Sarah received an unexpected visit. It was a young woman, about 25 years old, accompanied by 2 small children. "Mrs. Sarah, my name is Elizabeth Miller. I came from Kansas specifically to meet you." "Elizabeth? What a beautiful name. And courageous. My grandmother gave me this name after reading the story of your great-grandmother. She said she wanted me to have the courage of the original Elizabeth." The young woman shared that she had been inspired by Sarah's story to leave an abusive relationship and start over. She had sold everything she had, taken her 2 children, and moved to a small town in the countryside where no one knew her. "I didn't have an inheritance waiting for me like you did, but I had something the story taught me, the certainty that it was possible to begin again." "And what did you do?" "I learned to make homemade cakes and sweets. I started selling them on the street, going door to door. Today I have a small bakery that supports my children decently, and I'm helping 2 other women who were in the same situation I was. Sarah hugged the young Elizabeth and her children. It was as if she were seeing the continuation of the story, proof that the seeds planted 100 years ago by her great-grandmother were still sprouting in places and people she could never have imagined. Elizabeth, do you know what the most beautiful part of your story is? What? It's that you didn't come here just to thank me. You came to show me that the story continues, that every woman who finds the courage to start over plants a new seed. And that seed will sprout in the lives of other women who haven't even been born yet. At that moment, Sarah understood her mission was complete, not because the work had ended, it never would, but because it had become self-sustaining. Courage had truly become contagious. At 70 years old, Sarah remained active but had passed the operational coordination of the program to the new generation. Michael coordinated administrative aspects. Emily handled the artistic and cultural part. Ethan managed environmental sustainability. Mary Elizabeth led the food and nutrition area. Anthony coordinated animal care and assisted therapy. Twins John and Joseph used music as a therapeutic tool. Ava directed the entire legal department. Francis coordinated psychological services, and Hope led the educational area. Each of them had brought their own innovations to the program, always respecting the fundamental principles established by Sarah, but adapting them to the needs of modern times. The program now included technology courses for rural women, digital entrepreneurship workshops, specialized psychological support for domestic violence victims, and even a special program for elderly women wanting to restart their lives after widowhood. Mrs. Margaret had passed away at 90, but left a legacy of wisdom that continued to be passed down by the program's senior facilitators. Her stories and teachings were shared with each new class as part of the project's oral tradition. One summer afternoon, Sarah was sitting on the main house's porch when she saw a school van arriving. It was students from a New York City university coming to learn about the project for academic research. Among the students was a young woman who immediately caught her attention. She had a determined and familiar expression, very much resembling Sarah herself when she was young. After the project presentation, the young woman approached. "Mrs. Sarah, my name is Carol Elizabeth Johnson Smith. My grandmother was one of the first women to participate in your program." Sarah smiled. She was the granddaughter of Carol, who had specialized in diet sweets. "Your grandmother was an extraordinary woman, and from what I see, the determination has passed to you. Mrs. Sarah, I'm in my final year of psychology and want to dedicate my career to working with women in vulnerable situations. I came here because I want to understand how you achieve such consistent results." "What do you think makes the difference, Carol Elizabeth?" The young woman thought for a moment. "I think it's because you don't treat women as victims. You treat them as protagonists of their own stories." "Exactly. And do you know why we do that?" "Why?" "Because that's how we learned. Each of us, at some point, had to stop seeing ourselves as victims and start seeing ourselves as heroes of our own journey. And once you make that change, there's no going back." Carol Elizabeth spent the rest of the afternoon talking with Sarah about therapeutic techniques, empowerment methodologies, and sustainability strategies for social projects. It was evident she had not only academic knowledge but also the passion and determination needed to continue the work. "Mrs. Sarah, can I do my internship here?" "Of course, but on one condition." "What?" "That you understand you'll learn much more than you'll teach. The women who come here are the real teachers. They're the ones who will teach you about courage, resilience, and the capacity for transformation." 6 months later, Carol Elizabeth became one of the youngest coordinators in the program's history. She brought a modern academic perspective without losing the human and empathetic essence that had always characterized the work. At 75, Sarah Johnson had drastically reduced her public activities, but continued to live on the property and receive daily visits from people all over the world who came to learn about the project. During one of these visits, she welcomed a group of lawmakers from the United States Congress who were studying the possibility of turning the program's methodology into national public policy. "Mrs. Johnson," said the senator leading the group, "we need your guidance to ensure that any potential public policy maintains the efficiency of the original program." "Senator, I'm honored by the interest, but I have a concern. What is it? When a program like this becomes public policy, it often loses its soul. It turns into bureaucracy, process, numbers, and it forgets that it's dealing with human lives. How can we avoid that? By making sure the decisions are made by people who have already been through the program, not by experts who have never been in the shoes of a woman in a vulnerable situation. The senator carefully noted all of Sarah's recommendations. The bill was approved 2 years later, creating a national program based on the methodology developed on the property. The law stipulated that all centers must be coordinated by women who had benefited from similar programs, ensuring that the perspective of those who lived the experience would always be maintained. At 80, Sarah woke up on a spring morning with a strange feeling. It wasn't pain or physical discomfort, it was a sense of completeness, as if a cycle was closing. She dressed and walked slowly to the original cabin. Inside, she sat in the same chair where Elizabeth had sat 100 years earlier to write her letters. Sarah took paper and pen and began to write her own letter to the future. To whoever finds this letter, my name is Sarah Johnson, and I write this in the year 2060, 50 years after I fled to this cabin with my 8 children. If you are reading this, it is because our story continues. I learned that courage is not a personality trait. It is a choice you make every day, every difficult moment, every time you need to decide between accepting a bad situation or fighting for something better. I learned that no woman is truly free while other women are still trapped. Our freedom is only complete when it is shared. I learned that true wealth is not in what you accumulate, but in what you build for the people who come after you. If you are reading this because you are going through a hard time, know that you are stronger than you think. Know that you deserve a good life. Know that it is possible to start over as many times as necessary. And most importantly, know that you are not alone. You are part of a lineage of courageous women that extends far beyond what you can see. Use that ancestral strength, trust it, and then pass it on. With all love and all hope, Sarah Johnson. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in the same hiding spot where she had found Elizabeth's letters 50 years before. That afternoon, during a family lunch, Sarah announced her decision. I want to organize a big party. A party to celebrate 50 years since our arrival here and 150 years since Elizabeth built this cabin. What kind of party, Mom? Asked Emily. I want to invite all the women who have ever been through the program, all their families, all the coordinators and facilitators. I want it to be a celebration of life, courage, and women's resilience. The party was organized for the same day Sarah had arrived at the cabin 50 years earlier. Over 3,000 people attended. Women from all over the United States and from various countries who had participated in programs based on the methodology created by Sarah. There were booths with products made by former participants, musical performances, craft exhibitions, and most of all, many stories being told and retold. Christina, now 70 years old and owner of a chain of 5 stores, came accompanied by her employees and her daughters. Beatrice, the one with the cosmetics company, brought her whole family and several employees. Carol, the one with the diet sweets, came with her children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. During the party, Sarah went up on a small stage to give a speech. At 80 years old, she still had a steady voice and a determined gaze. Friends, when I arrived here 50 years ago, I was a desperate woman. I had no idea I was coming to the place where my life would truly begin. Today, looking at you, I see what we have really built together. She pointed to the crowd. Each of you took the seed of courage you found here and planted it in your own communities. You created thousands of jobs, educated thousands of children, inspired thousands of other women. You proved that when women support each other, there is no limit to what we can achieve. The crowd applauded emotionally. But I want you to understand something very important. This party is not for me. This party is for Elizabeth, who 150 years ago planted the first seed. It is for Mrs. Margaret, who welcomed me when I needed it most. It is for each of you who had the courage to start over. And most of all, it is for all the women who will come after us. At the end of the speech, Sarah made a special request. I want each of you to tell your story to at least one young woman today. I want you to plant seeds of courage in a new generation, because that is how our story continues, being told, being lived, being passed on. The party lasted until late at night. There were conversation circles in every corner of the property, with women from different generations exchanging experiences and knowledge. An 18-year-old girl, daughter of a former program participant, approached Sarah at the end of the party. "Mrs. Sarah, I wanted to thank you for changing my mother's life. If it weren't for that, I wouldn't have had the opportunities I've had. What is your name, dear?" "Hope. My mother gave me that name after she participated in the program." Sarah smiled. There were dozens of girls named Hope, Elizabeth, Sarah, and Margaret, born into families that had been impacted by the program. "Hope, what is your dream?" "I want to be a doctor. I want to work in rural communities, caring for women and children who don't have easy access to healthcare." "And you will achieve it. Do you know why?" "Why?" "Because you already have the most important tool, the conviction that it is possible. Your mother gave you that inheritance, and you will pass it on to the people you care for." The morning after the party, Sarah woke up with a deep peace in her heart. She had clearly seen that the work that began with her desperate escape had become a self-sustaining and irreversible movement. Thousands of women spread across the world now carried within them the certainty that it was possible to start over, that it was possible to turn pain into strength, that it was possible to build a dignified life for themselves and their children. She walked through the property observing all the ongoing projects. The factory was running at full capacity, coordinated by women who had started as beneficiaries and were now business leaders. The school served hundreds of children from the region, with a methodology that combined academic knowledge and traditional wisdom. The training center received groups of 20 women every 3 months, and the waiting list had more than 500 names. The similar centers spread across the country, and the world operated with the same efficiency and warmth. Anthony's veterinary clinic not only cared for the region's animals, but also developed research on rural veterinary medicine that became an international reference. The Twins music studio had become a hub of regional culture that promoted local artists. Ava's law office offered free legal assistance to women in vulnerable situations and had already secured hundreds of important victories in child custody and property division cases. Francis's psychology clinic served not only the program's participants, but the entire regional community, offering family, individual, and group therapy. Hope's continuing education school offered everything from adult literacy to advanced technical courses, always focusing on the reality and needs of the rural population. Each of her children had found a way to contribute to the family legacy, but had also developed their own identities and personal projects. Michael was nationally recognized as an expert in social project management and consulted for organizations worldwide. Emily had become a renowned artist, but always donated a significant portion of her profits to the program. Ethan was a university professor and researcher in sustainable agriculture, having developed techniques used in several countries. Mary Elizabeth had written regional cookbooks that preserved culinary traditions that were fading away. They all had their own families, children who grew up knowing the family history and participating in social projects from a young age. At 85, Sarah remained lucid and active, but felt her body beginning to show signs of fatigue. She began dedicating more time to writing, documenting not only her own story, but the stories of hundreds of women who had gone through the program. The oral history project she created resulted in a library with over 2,000 recorded testimonies. Each story was unique, but all had common elements: the courage to leave difficult situations, the discovery of strengths they didn't know they possessed, and the transformation from victims into protagonists. In one of these interviews, Sarah spoke with Elizabeth Miller, the young woman who had visited the property years before. Now she had a network of 5 bakeries and employed 50 people. "Elizabeth, when you look back at the woman you were when you first arrived here, what do you feel?" "I feel gratitude, Mrs. Sarah. Gratitude for finding courage, gratitude for finding you and this place, but mostly gratitude for discovering that I was capable of much more than I imagined." And what advice would you give to a woman who is in the situation you were in today? I would say the first step is always the hardest, but once you take that first step, the next ones get easier. And you don't need courage to take all the steps at once. You need courage to take one step at a time. Do you still get scared sometimes? I do, Mrs. Sarah. But now I know that fear is just a feeling, not an order. When I feel afraid, I remember the woman I was and the woman I became. And then it becomes clear that I can feel fear and still do what needs to be done. These interviews became study material in universities worldwide. Researchers from various fields, psychology, sociology, economics, management, studied the factors that made the program so effective. But the participants themselves already knew the answer. The program worked because it treated each woman as a complete human being, with the potential to grow and contribute. Not as a problem to be solved, but as a solution waiting to be discovered. At 90 years old, Sarah received a visit that moved her deeply. It was a delegation of African women who had implemented similar programs in their countries and wanted to learn about the original experience. The delegation leader, a 50-year-old woman named Amara, shared how she had used the methodology to create training centers in 3 African countries. Mrs. Sarah, we adapted your program to our cultural reality but kept the fundamental principles. We've already served over 1,000 women in vulnerable situations. What adaptations did you make? We included traditional African farming and craft techniques. We created credit cooperatives based on traditional community savings systems. And we used storytelling, which is very strong in our culture, as a therapeutic tool. That's wonderful, Amara. You understood that the methodology is a skeleton, but each culture needs to put its own flesh on the bones. Exactly. And we want you to know that your work is changing lives in places you can't even imagine. Amara showed photos and videos of the African women who had been helped. They were different faces, different languages, different cultures, but the expression of determination and hope was exactly the same as Sarah saw on the faces of American women. Mrs. Sarah, I have a personal question for you. Feel free. Have you ever regretted anything on this journey? Sarah thought for a long moment. You know, Amara, I sometimes think if I could have started all this earlier, if I could have found courage before, I think about how many women I could have helped if I had discovered my strength at 20 instead of 35. And what did you conclude? That everything has its time. I needed to go through everything I went through to become the person capable of creating this work. You can't speed up the process of a seed maturing. It germinates when it's ready. At the end of the visit, Amara gave Sarah a special gift, a hand-painted African cloth with the image of a giant tree whose branches stretched over an entire continent, protecting hundreds of small female figures. This tree represents you, Mrs. Sarah, and each of these small figures represents a woman who has been touched by your work, directly or indirectly. Sarah was moved by the gift. It was the most perfect visual representation of what her life had become. A tree that grew from a small seed of courage and now offered shade and protection to thousands of others. At 95 years old, Sarah spent most of her time in the original cabin, which had become her favorite place for reflection and writing. She spent hours telling stories to her great-granddaughters and great-grandsons who came to visit her. One such afternoon, her youngest great-granddaughter, a 5-year-old girl named Elizabeth Hope, asked a question that surprised her. "Great-grandma, why do people say you're famous?" Sarah smiled and picked up the girl in her lap. "What do you think, Elizabeth Hope?" "I think it's because you help people." "And why do you think I help people?" The girl thought for a moment with the typical seriousness of young children. "Because when we help others, we feel happy inside." "You're very wise, Elizabeth Hope, that's exactly it." "Great-grandma, when I grow up, will I help people too?" "You already do, my love. Every time you're kind to someone, every time you share a toy, every time you make someone smile, you're helping. But I want to help like you help. Then you will, because the desire to help is in your heart, and when you grow up, your heart will show you your special way of helping. That night, Sarah wrote in her diary, "Today I understood that my mission is truly complete. Not because the work has ended, but because it has become eternal. It lives on in the next generation, and the generation after that, and in all the generations to come. Little Elizabeth Hope is 5 years old, and already understands that helping others is a source of happiness. Her parents grew up seeing social work as a natural part of life. Her grandparents dedicated their careers to expanding and improving social programs. What began as a desperate escape became a dynasty of solidarity. What started as a material inheritance became a much greater legacy. The certainty that it is always possible to start over, always possible to improve, always possible to help. Elizabeth planted the first seed 150 years ago. I watered that seed and it became a tree. My children turned that tree into a forest. My grandchildren are spreading seeds from that forest all over the world, and my great-grandchildren will ensure that this forest never stops growing. This is the true legacy I leave, not lands or buildings or money, but the unshakable conviction that every woman carries within her a strength capable of transforming the world. On her 100th birthday, Sarah received thousands of letters and messages from all over the world. Women who had been touched by her work, directly or indirectly, sent moving testimonies about how their lives had changed. One of these letters came from a 20-year-old American girl. "Dear Mrs. Sarah, my name is Hope, Esperanza in English, and I am the great-granddaughter of Mary, a Brazilian immigrant who participated in your program in the 2040s. Mary brought to the United States not only the technique of making preserves that she learned from you, but especially the certainty that it was possible to start over as many times as necessary. This certainty passed to my great-grandmother, then to my grandmother, then to my mother, and now to me. When I was going through a difficult time in my adolescence, my mother told me the whole story of our family, and especially your story. Today I work in a shelter for at-risk teenagers, and I use the principles I learned through our family's history. I have already helped more than 100 young people find better paths for their lives. I wanted you to know that your influence has reached here, on the other side of the world, and is making a difference in the lives of people who don't even speak Portuguese. Love and courage are truly universal." Letters like this arrived from every continent. The methodology created on the small rural property in Pennsylvania had spread throughout the world and adapted to completely different realities, but always maintaining the essence: dignified treatment, practical training, strengthening of self-esteem, and creation of mutual support networks. At the 100th birthday party, Sarah insisted that the celebration be simple, as the festivities on the property had always been. She only asked that each person present briefly share how they had been touched by the work developed there. The stories went on for hours. There were women from 3 different generations: the pioneers who had participated in the first programs, their daughters who grew up seeing their mothers transform, and their granddaughters who were born into already structured and prosperous families. There were also representatives from dozens of countries where similar programs had been created. Each spoke in their own language, but all the stories carried the same message: gratitude for the opportunity to start over, and a commitment to pass that opportunity forward. At the end of the party, Sarah asked to speak publicly one last time. "My friends, when I was 35 years old and fled to this cabin with my 8 children, I thought I had reached the end of the line. I thought my life was over and that I was just trying to survive. Today, at 100 years old, I look at you and see that, in fact, that escape was the beginning of everything. That was the moment I stopped being a victim of circumstances and began being the protagonist of my own story. Each of you has made the same journey. Each of you had a moment when you decided you deserved something better, and each of you proved that when a woman decides to change her life, she doesn't just change her own life. She changes the lives of her children, her community, and the world around her. Now I want to make one last request of you. Never let the girls of the next generation forget that they can be anything they want to be. Never let them accept a life too small for their dreams. And most importantly, never let them forget that when women support each other, there is no limit to what we can achieve. The property where it all began became a national historic landmark, but it continued operating as it always had, welcoming women who needed to start over and offering the necessary tools for that transformation. The original cabin became a museum, but a living museum where the stories of Elizabeth and Sarah were told daily to visitors from all over the world, and where new stories continued to be written every day. At 102 years old, Sarah woke up on a spring morning knowing that would be her last day. It wasn't a sad or scary feeling. It was a feeling of completeness, of mission accomplished. She spent the day visiting all the important places on the property, silently saying goodbye to each space that had witnessed her journey. In the afternoon, she gathered all her children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and great-great-grandchildren. "I want you all to know that I lived a full and happy life. A life that had more love, more purpose, and more fulfillment than I ever imagined possible. You are living proof that it's possible to turn pain into strength, need into opportunity, fear into courage. You are my greatest pride and my greatest achievement. Take care of each other, take care of the work we built together, and most importantly, never forget that every person you help plants a seed that can grow and nourish future generations." Sarah passed away peacefully that night, sleeping in the same bed where she had slept her first night in the cabin 67 years earlier. Her funeral was an international event. Representatives from 50 countries came to pay their respects, but the most moving tributes came from the ordinary women who had been touched by her work. Thousands of women walked in procession to the property, each carrying a flower and a story of how Sarah had changed their lives. The walk lasted 3 days, and the flowers covered the entire expanse of the property. On Sarah's tombstone, next to Elizabeth's grave, a plaque was placed with the phrase she had chosen to summarize her life philosophy. "Courage is contagious. When one woman frees herself, she frees other women. When one woman grows, she helps other women grow. When one woman wins, all women win." End of story. So, dear listener, what did you think of Sarah's journey? Could you feel the strength and courage she discovered within herself? This story shows us that no matter how difficult our situation, there is always a possibility for a new beginning. Sarah turned a desperate escape into a movement that changed thousands of lives around the world. Tell us in the comments, do you know any brave woman like Sarah? Leave your like if the story inspired you and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other moving stories like this one.